The hermeneutical key for such a renewed reflection on the sacred is the first foundational chapter of the Second Vatican Council's Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, where the liturgy is defined as an exercise of the priestly office, munus of Jesus Christ. The Constitution goes on to say, in the liturgy, the sanctification of man is signified by signs perceptible to the senses and is effected in a way which corresponds with each of these signs. In the liturgy, the whole public worship is performed by the mystical body of Jesus Christ, that is, by the head and his members. This passage restates a key principle of Catholic worship already formulated by St. Thomas Aquinas. The liturgy is seen as the exercise of the priesthood of Christ, to be more precise, of Christus totus, the whole Christ, following a principle that guided St. Augustine's exegesis, especially of the Psalms. The whole Christ, that is, Christ the head, and the members of his mystical body, which is the Church, the communion of the baptized. Those who participate in this exercise of Christ's priesthood are the ordained priest who acts in the person of Christ the head by virtue of his priestly ordination, and the baptized faithful as members of the mystical body. And note that at this point, Sacrosanctum Concilium introduces the notion of the sacredness of the liturgy when it explains, from this it follows that every liturgical celebration, because it is an action of Christ the priest and of his body, which is the Church, is a sacred action, actio sacra, surpassing all others. No other action of the Church can equal its efficacy by the same title and to the same degree. In other words, Sacrosanctum Concilium considers sacredness always derived from the liturgy, which is the presence and action of Christ in his mystical body. This follows again a principle formulated by St. Thomas Aquinas that we call a thing sacred, sacrum, because of its relation to divine worship, ad cultum divinum. Unlike personal and interior prayer, the liturgy is an external action which has its concrete and material forms of expressions in which the human senses are always involved. Public worship, thus, is in need of its proper place, its proper time, and its proper objects that are specifically dedicated so that it can be performed, to use a term from the field of ritual studies, or celebrated, to use the term from liturgical theology, as a sacred action. It is in relation to this sacred action that we also speak of sacred space, sacred time, or sacred objects. Regarding sacred objects, the American musicologist William P. Mart perceptively notes two complementary aspects: an intrinsic suitability or aptness to the sacred purpose, and a process of being received as sacred. The process of reception can take the form of gradual acceptance or of immemorial convention. An example for gradual acceptance is the chasuble as a liturgical vestment. This was originally the common outer garment worn by well-to-do Roman citizens in late antiquity, the pennula. Initially, its liturgical use was distinguished by the material quality of a specific vestment and by its being set aside for worship. However, the chasuble proved to be intrinsically suitable for sacred use because it covers the bishop or priest more or less completely, and so draws attention to his acting in persona Christi rather than to his individuality. An example for immemorial convention would be the use of incense. Its rare origin, sweet-smelling perfume, and high ascending smoke easily lend it for liturgical worship, although it was rejected in earliest Christianity because of its connection with pagan worship. It was eventually adopted as a symbol of the prayers of the faithful rising to God. There's another essential aspect to consider here. From the Christian perspective, the sacredness of the liturgy is based on its sacramental character. And Sacrosanctum Concilium affirms that in the liturgy, which is the exercise of the priesthood of Christ, the sanctification of man is signified and at the same time effected by signs perceptible to the senses. It obviously refers to the sacraments. Now, the essential rites of the sacraments, form and matter in scholastic terminology, are distinguished by stupendous humility and simplicity. The liturgy, as sacred action, surrounds these essential rites with other rites and ceremonies that illustrate them and help the faithful to a better understanding of the mystery that is made present. The reality of the sacraments, which is veiled and hidden to the senses, is translated into signs that are perceptible and hence more easily accessible to our understanding. The purpose of this is that the Christian community, instructed by the sacred actions, sacris actionibus erudita, as an ancient prayer in the Gregorian sacramentary says, be properly disposed to receive God's grace and blessing. The sacred character of the liturgy can thus be seen as part of a divine pedagogy. For Aquinas, the elements of human institution in the sacraments, while not being essential to them, belong to the solemnity or solemnitas that serves to awaken devotion and reverence in those who receive it, especially in the Most Holy Eucharist. The English Dominican Aidan Nichols speaks of the idiom of worship, a concept that is by no means restricted to the linguistic aspects of the liturgy and covers more or less the same ground as Aquinas' idea of solemnitas. I would therefore propose to see in the sacrality of the liturgy the expression of its sacramentality. Consequently, the question needs to be asked whether Catholic theologians who have endorsed the movement towards a desacralization have a strong enough sense of the sacramental principle and still acknowledge sacramental reality in its full sense. In his book, The Spirit of the Liturgy, Joseph Ratzinger offers another perspective on the meaning of the sacred in Christianity when he responds to theological critics of the idea that there should be any such thing as sacred time or sacred space in Christianity. This critique takes as a scriptural basis Christ's announcement in St. John's Gospel of a worship in spirit and in truth, John chapter 4. This is correctly taken to mean the transition from temple sacrifice to universal worship. It would be erroneous, however, to draw the consequence that such universal worship is no longer bound by the frames and boundaries of the sacred. Then Cardinal recalls that we live in a time of not yet. That is, we have not yet passed over to the new Jerusalem where God himself and the Lamb are its temple. Certainly, with the revelation of the incarnate Son of God, this new reality has entered into our world, but only in an inchoative way, like, as he says, the time of dawn when darkness and light are intermingled. And this is a reference to the commentary of St. Gregory the Great on the Apostle Paul's word, the night is far gone, the day is at hand. So we are in an intermediate state between already and not yet. In this state, the empirical conditions of life in this world are still in force. And for this reason, the distinction between the sacred and the quotidian still hold, even if this distinction is not conceived of as an absolute separation. With early Christian theologians, this time can be described as an image between shadow and reality, and so the dynamic character of the sacred is highlighted. Through it, the whole world is to be transformed into the worship of God, but this will be fully realized only at the end of time. Human existence in this world is structured by space and time, and so are prayer and divine worship. Therefore, the liturgy too needs a place where it can be carried out as a sacred action. In the words of Pope Benedict's remarkable homily for the Feast of Corpus Christi in 2012, God sent his Son into the world not to abolish, but to give fulfillment also to the sacred. At the height of this mission at the Last Supper, Jesus instituted the sacrament of his body and blood, the memorial of his paschal sacrifice. By doing so, he replaced the ancient sacrifices with himself, but he did so in a rite which he commanded the apostles to perpetuate as a supreme sign of the true sacred, which is he himself.